Hey, greetings, everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Alan West here, the Executive Director of the American Constitutional Rights Union and ACRU Action Fund. I'm joining you today from a hotel room here on the campus of Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, because right now, on behalf of the Young Americas Foundation, I'm speaking on a couple of college and university campuses, Wake Forest University last night, Duke University tonight, and I'll be heading to the University of Pittsburgh and then finishing up at Fresno State University before the end of this semester. And it's just so great to be able to go and talk to these young conservative students, especially about what we just witnessed happen in the 2024 election cycle, which really showed an incredible trend of this country going toward, once again, constitutional conservatism, not wanting to see that centralized government control of their lives, and restoring security, being it economic security, energy security, national security, border security, domestic security, educational security, and also a foreign policy that once again gets back to the mantra of peace through strength. So when you think about one of the monumental things that have come out of this election and the incoming Trump administration is one of these agencies, a commission, a committee that's called the Department of Government Efficiency. You hear people talking about how we've got to get the federal government back into that restraining box that the Constitution of the United States of America intended it to be. Some of us call that constitutional governance, because when you read the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, there are 18 enumerated powers, very specific duties, responsibilities, roles that the federal government has. And of course, then you have the 10th Amendment that says all of those specific duties that are not designated to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. So to talk about this issue of constitutional governance, I could not think of anyone better than the ACRU's very own Tom McHale, who has written a very good in-depth book about the Constitution, and he'll share that with us. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Good. Thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
You know, when you look at this whole federal government, one of the things that I shared with the kids last night at Wake Forest University was that in 1961, when I was born, I went back and you can look this up. The debt of the United States of America was $463 billion. Now we see the debt of the United States of America somewhere at $35 trillion. And we've seen this expansive growth of the federal government, but we have not gotten a good return on investment. How do we, tackle this thing, and what mindset do we need to confront to make sure that we get the right type of federal government once again restored to this country based upon the Constitution?
One thing that I always look back to is we are in a position now where the bureaucracy, and I'll just use that collectively, is making law. And it kind of goes back to the old saying of if it sounds like a duck and looks like a duck, or however that goes. I mean, that's where we are now. We've got all these agencies out there creating reams of paperwork, people going to work every day, where they're deemed successful if they add more things, if they add more rules and regulations and policy. When does it stop? Do you remember any of that ever being taken away? Do you remember a federal bureaucrat ever getting a pat on the back and a bonus for saying, hey, I removed 47 useless things from the, our rules and regulations for society? I don't.
No, you don't. And so it appears that we reward people for the expansion of government, but then all of a sudden, when you have the government hearing that, oh my God, someone from the private sector, being a Vivek Ramaswamy or Elon Musk, is now in charge of looking at us and making us effective and efficient, maybe people need to pay attention to what Elon Musk did at Twitter when he came in and took over.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the number was 80%. He came through and figured out there was arguably 80% waste, because before he came on, it was up and running with, I don't even know how many millions of users. Mm-hmm. After all that, guess what? It's still up and running with millions more users, right?
Yeah. And so it's so important that people understand that whenever we talk about doing something to the public sector, they get so upset. But then the bureaucracy of the federal government and government overall are the ones that are making all the rules and decisions about the private sector, to include shutting it down. So do you kind of see this as now all of a sudden we're flipping the page, and now we have individuals that are coming from the private sector saying, let's make this government more like the private sector. Let's make sure it can be effective and efficient.
I would take it one step further because I think the private sector reflects you and I and everyone
Hmm.
out there listening. We have individual budgets we have to make work. We don't get to step back and say, well, hey, I need to add more taxes this year because I've got my cable bills doubled. We have to operate under a budget and we have to make hard decisions and cut things when we want to add something else. So I love the fact that through private industry, this is making its way back to how do we manage the government?
When you talk about how you manage the government, when you look at a private sector agency, I mean, a private sector company, they can't create a new department or whatever unless they have the revenue that comes along with it. But yet, if you go back, remember, once upon a time, we had this government agency called HEW. It was Health, Education, and Welfare. And I got
Mhm.
some issues about, government doling out welfare. But all of a sudden, in the Carter administration, we split it out and created three different ones. One of those was the Department of Education. Is there any place in the Constitution where the federal government has an enumerated power to deal with the issue of education in the United States of America?
I keep looking through Section 8, and I found piracy, I found weights and measures, I found taxation. I did not see that anywhere. Oh.
So how do we get to the point where all of a sudden, again, you had this one government agency, and then all of a sudden it splits out, and now we got Health and Human Services, we got Education, and we got HUD. And again, when you think about the creation of a Department of Education, unconstitutional, what has happened with the education standards in the United States of America? Have they increased because we created this government bureaucracy?
It's funny. I keep hearing all the arguing on social media, and it kind of breaks my brain because it goes along the lines of we can't get rid of the Department of Education because we have the worst education system and spend more money. So we have to have the Department of Education to fix it. I mean, there's this circular logic because what was it, 1979?
Yes, and Carter administration.
Okay,
Yes.
so you and I are this close in age, right?
Mhm.
I had pretty much my entire education before the creation of the Department of Education. Guess what? The states had the power over that as they are supposed to, and it worked just fine.
And I think that's one of the things that people need to understand was that this department called Department of Education, 1979, that's less than 50 years ago. And so this is not something that's been around for quite some time. And you're right. I was born in 1961, so I have graduated high school, getting ready to go in as a freshman in college, and there was no Department of Education. And guess what? I had a good quality education. I understood my reading, my writing, my arithmetic. But now, since we have had this Department of Education, look at the quality of education out there. Look at the lack of adherence to standards and the fact that we have young people that aren't reading and write and doing math at grade level, but yet we have a Department of Education that we continue to spend money on. That's oxymoronic, wouldn't you say?
I think the important thing to note here is your opinion and my opinion on whether it's gotten better or worse. Don't trust that. Look at the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
It has measurably gotten worse.
No doubt about it. And so Jimmy Carter decides that, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to create the Department of Energy, and the Department of Energy is going to make us energy independent. Has the Department of Energy ever made us energy independent, Tom?
No, I believe that has come from strong leadership in the past, not the Department of Energy, that's for sure. Tell you, I, for one, am looking back. I'm looking forward to getting back to energy independence.
Yeah,
I mean, I would suspect you're very passionate about that from a national security perspective.
Well, absolutely. I mean, when we during the Trump administration were producing, consuming, and exporting net export of our energy resources, it helped our economy. It helped our national security stand. We weren't going to the Middle East, OPEC nations, but now all of a sudden we're going hat in hand and begging because we have undermined that. So here again, when you see people saying that, yeah, Department of Energy is another agency that probably needs to go away. It's only been around for 50 years, and it has not met up to the standards what people have said. So why do you think it is that these people in Washington, D.C. just don't want to see these agencies go away.
I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I would, I've always kind of wanted to ask you, from an outsider, you spent a couple of years in Congress, and from an outsider perspective, what I see is people going into, I'll just loosely call it the establishment, Congress, bureaucracy, whatever. And then all of a sudden it becomes how can I make this a career? How can we keep this machine rolling and moving forward? And, it's a little bit of a self-perpetuating machine. I mean, I'm sure you see all of the incumbent reelection campaigns. Once you get in there, it's kind of hard for somebody to take you out these days.
Mm-hmm. Well, we call it, in the military, we used to call it the self-licking ice cream cone. And that's exactly what you see happening with Washington, D.C. and politics, because, it all feeds itself. And so now all of a sudden you have the K Street lobbyists, who many of them were former members of Congress. When they lose it, they go over to the K Street lobby, because now all of a sudden they're hired as the experts on making the rules and regulations of things that they did when they were in Congress. So that whole self-licking ice cream cone is in a tizzy, because, well, who's going to lobby for, education if we don't have a Department of Education? Who's going to go out there and lobby if we don't have a Department of Energy, blah, blah, blah. Or when you look at the defense military industrial complex, we just had a Pentagon that for the 7th year in a row failed an audit. I mean,
right.
Don't you think that has to be looked at? I mean, for effectiveness and efficiency?
What was it, a couple of $1 trillion, or just over time, or just completely unaccounted for?
Yeah, and when you look at all these defense contractors, I mean, and I'll admit that when I was after I retired, I went back to Afghanistan as a contractor to work as a civilian military advisor to the Afghanistan National Army, because I filled that gap that the military couldn't. But there are some contractors out there that they're not meeting their standards. I mean, I had to produce, a set of criteria, standards that working with the military, I had to meet those standards, or else you voided your contract and you were terminated. But I just don't understand how we're losing track of an agency, one of the largest that we have, $865 billion is their budget, and they still cannot find the money and pass an audit. What happens in the private sector, Tom? You don't pass an audit.
You're done.
Yeah.
Yet, I wonder, I think the sentiment is pervasive, but what if every budgeting cycle reset back to zero, and through results and through performance, you had to justify the budget you had last year instead of, well, we had this last year, so we automatically get that again, and we need 10% more, right? Let's go back to zero, maybe.
And that's one of the critical things that you just brought up, is the budgeting system of the federal government is a baseline budget. So every budget cycle, they start from the previous year, which is the baseline, and they never cut spending. They are only cutting the rate of the increase of spending that they go towards. And so many people, private sector, in our homes, we do a zero-based budget. We have to start at zero.
Yep.
And we look at the revenues that are coming in, and that's how we determine what we will spend. We need to institute that at the federal government level.
You brought up Elon Musk and Twitter a few minutes ago, and that's exactly what happened there. When he came in, he went to a zero-based budget. He didn't say, okay, we've got 100% of our existing, staff and infrastructure. How much future growth are we going to slow down? He said, nope. We have zero staff and infrastructure. How much do I absolutely have to keep things going?
What do you think? I mean, when you sit back and look at this, the detractors out there that are trying to hold on to this massive federal government bureaucracy, do you think that the American people have finally said enough? We want to make sure we get a good return on our tax dollars, which what you say is an investment to the federal government, when it's not an investment. You're just, misappropriating our money.
I feel like we're off to a good start. I feel like, and this is conjecture on my part, but I feel like people have been, we've had pain inflicted on us economically over the past few years. And I think people are starting to make that connection to say, hey, I've got to make tough decisions. I've got to decide what has to be cut from my budget to make room for something else. Whereas government over here just adds and adds and adds and borrows from China, prints money, when they want to do something else. That's not right.
Yeah, it's not like the B-52 song Legal Tender where we can go into the basement and print our own money. And if you guys have never heard that song, you should listen to it. I mean, it's one of my favorite B-52 songs. Tom, as we get ready to wrap up, what are some of the other agencies or what are examples of some very frivolous spending programs that you think definitely need to go the way of the dodo bird?
I have to say I'm only half joking when I've made this comment in similar discussions in the past. I would bet lunch that you could go through DC and just tag every other building and close it down. And I'm not sure us and our listeners, I'm not sure we would see a material difference in our day-to-day lives. I think that tells you everything you need to know.
No, you're absolutely right, because I think that the Department of Education has 3 to 5 different office buildings in Washington, D.C. And I know that that's one of the things they're looking at is let's just have the federal government sell some of this property back as you start to right size and downsize and restore constitutional governance. Tom, thanks so much for joining us. Where can people find your book that you wrote about the Constitution and get a copy of it?
Real quick, I'm an everyday citizen like everybody else, passionate about having a better life for me and my family and future generations. I got motivated one day years and years ago to say, hey, I need to know more about this. So I decided this stuff is needlessly complex. So I set about writing a book called The Practical Guide to the United States Constitution. And the whole idea is to make it simple enough, factually accurate, but simple enough that even a career politician can understand it. No offense intended, because you're not a career politician, right? Let's be clear about that. You did the right thing. You came back and, went back to work. So, but you can find it anywhere. Find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. That's the easiest and quickest way to get your hands on a copy. The Practical Guide to the United States Constitution. It's also linked on the ACRU website on our reading list, theacru.org.
And how can people follow Tom McHale?
I'm on social media, usually at Tom McHale for Facebook, Twitter, accounts like that. So love to connect with you there.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure working with you here at the American Constitutional Rights Union and all of the insights, the great insights and perspectives you have on restoring the Constitution and restoring this republic and restoring constitutional governance. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us on this episode of Live Free TV. And please follow us at theacru.org. That's theacru.org. God bless. Take care.